we had a pleasure to invite one of our postcards, Michael Barnard. Mike is a climate futurist and he's a master, in my view, in redefining the energy and the energy for the future. And he's sharing his insights in the carbonization long time also into the future. That's why this climate futurists come from. He publishes articles on a number of energy topics. He serves as advisor on multiple boards of the large companies. And what we decided to focus on and have a short discussion with Michael, and it's a pleasure to have him there, is on the short list of climate action that will work that he has published in Forbes magazine last year. My name is Lada Strelnikova. I'm managing Energy Efficiency Fund since 2011, and we focus on the energy efficiency related investment in the European Union. Michael, thank you very much for joining us. It's a great pleasure to have you. And I thought let's talk about the short list of the climate actions that you have been discussing also and have been proposing, I would say, a very easy to-do list, if I may say so. And if I can start with electrifying everything. What the thought was from myself is actually to bring you some antitheses to this thesis, because the people that are saying that electrifying everything is probably not the best way to do is always brings us certain arguments. For example, if we have the short-haul aviation batteries, we don't have the batteries for the tracks, then we need a lot of materials. We need a lot of things. We need to dig earth into the valuable earth reserves. The grids are not able to handle all this increasing electricity, whatever we use it for, whether we whether they want to charge our electric vehicles, or we do different applications, and then that our grids are not stable, and then the different arguments are coming mainly around the grids and also around the batteries and the batteries' ability to use it. So how do you respond to this?
Sure. Well, let's start with the basic of electrify everything. Right now, we measure a lot of stuff by the primary energy, which is the coal, oil, gas, electrical generation from wind, solar, nuclear, and geothermal that comes into our economies. But that primary energy includes a lot of what we call rejected energy. It's mostly waste heat from burning fossil fuels. One of the ways I like to describe burning fossil fuels is that it's a process which creates a lot of carbon dioxide and a lot of waste heat, and some incidentally some stuff that's useful for us, like process heat or work. But when we electrify everything, we radically reduce the amount of energy we need coming into our system. I did the workup for the United States because it's a narcissistic overshare. So it's easy to get data from the United States and then extrapolate to other economies. For them, what I did is I did the analysis of if we electrified transportation, heat, used heat pumps, then what we'd see is a 50% reduction in the primary energy that was required for all the same energy services. And to be clear, this is a napkin sketch math. Other people have been doing it for a long time. Mark-Z Jacobson out of Stanford has been doing this. So that's the electrify everything premise. We don't need nearly as much energy as we think we do. So that's statement one. So as we look at one of the questions you asked, one of the antitheses, Simon Michaud was most famous for his, we can't electrify everything because we can't mine enough lithium. Well, the minerals problem is not nearly the problem that people make it out to be for a few reasons. One is right now we're extracting, processing, refining, and distributing just over 20 billion tons of fossil fuels annually. But we're mining in the critical batteries, minerals, that segment of mining. We're only mining a few millions of tons, so billions of tons of fossil fuels, millions of tons of metals. So
Yeah,
there's
but
a
this will going to increase. I mean, they will
oh,
come and it is
absolutely.
going up to billions as well.
No, not nearly. It has to double or triple, not go up by 1,000. When we need, because very simply, that 20 billion tons of fossil fuels, we mostly just burn once. And then we have to next year, we have to mine another and burn it again. With batteries, let's take an average Tesla Model 3. Maybe it has 60 kilograms of lithium in it, right? Just to, something like that. Well, that 60 kilograms of lithium gets reused over and over and over again for the 10-year life of the car. Then probably it gets taken out, packaged as stationary batteries for another 10 years until it's kind of reached the end of its life. Then we collect and mine the lithium back out of the recycled of the battery packs, and we make new batteries. We had to add some new lithium. The point is, the first statement is that we have heavy, heavy reuse of every mineral we mine, and then we have recycling of the minerals we mine because we're not turning them into waste heat, high entropy, or carbon dioxide, incredibly diffuse gas. They're sitting there in a chunk that is worth mining. And we're already extracting about 95% of EV batteries already and recycling them. We're at a high rate of recycling of EV batteries because they're big chunks of valuable resources. So the second thing is that we have high substitutability in minerals. So right now we have the lithium ion chemistry, but we also have the lithium phosphate chemistry. We also have the sodium ion chemistry that's emerging. We also have silicon anode chemistries. Basically, in the space of batteries, we have a whole bunch of different metals and chemistries that can be used to store energy. And we're just really, in some ways, starting that process.
Mm.
Even for transmission of electricity, well, we use copper because it has really nice characteristics. But we actually use aluminum for a lot of transmission because aluminum is light and highly conductive as well. It's just has slightly different characteristics. So even in wiring bundles, we can substitute other metals with similar characteristics to copper. And I'll just put it this way: aluminum is, I think, 8% of the Earth's crust is the precursor mineral to aluminum. And we can make aluminum, guess what, with electricity. That's what we do today in aluminum smelters. So we don't need nearly as much energy. We don't need nearly as many minerals. We reuse and substitute minerals. And the last part, there's a big belief that we have to somehow, because we're using a lot less electricity, there still is some belief that we have to move it thousands of miles. But in reality, we're generating a lot more electricity a lot closer to most end use points with solar and wind inside countries. There isn't a country in the world that can't put solar on rooftops. Even tiny nation states like Singapore can achieve 15% of their annual energy demand from solar that's inside their country. They can't put up wind turbines. That one, definitely not. But when I lived in Singapore, I could see Indonesia where there are wind turbines. And just just north of Singapore, there's Malaysia where there's lots of room for wind turbines. So we generate a lot more energy closer to end use. We need a lot less energy, and then high voltage direct current transmission is completely adequate to replace pipelines. So that's the electrify everything thing. So that gets the battery question, the minerals question. Now the grid question, yeah, we have to beef up our grids. But once again, we're not making our grids 12 or 14 times more robust. We're making them more robust. We're improving grids because grids are already ubiquitous.
Okay.
I've been all over the world. I have yet to be in a place where there wasn't a plug I couldn't find.
Mm.
You know, any place we have people, we have electricity now. And so we need to improve that, but we've also got ways to radically improve transmission with dirt cheap solutions. Let's take my
Mm.
favorite, the Heimdall ball from, I think it's Norway. Heimdall being the Norse god of seeing, who's a guardian of the Bifrost Bridge. If anybody remembers the recent Marvel mirror movies with Thor, um, Heimdall is just this ball. It's about, I think it weighs 8 pounds or something like that, and it can be put on transmission wires with a drone, and the drone just puts it on top of the wire, and it clamps on, and then it powers itself with induction from the electricity running through the wire. So it's just a tiny microscopic draw. What it does is it measures the heat of the actual wire and then uses mesh networks to transmit that data to a control center. So instead of using engineering rules of thumb,
Mm.
the grid operators can actually know exactly what the temperature of the wire is and increase the throughput. They've been seeing 30% increase of throughput through existing wires just with that one change.
Mm. But then there's, I mean, look, and then there's a lot of discussion on their, for example, in Germany, on their transmitting electricity where the windmills are in the northern part of Germany, going then, let's say, the electricity usage is then in the southern part of Germany, and then you need, and it's a huge discussion. Okay, you need to build all the connection for the 1,500 kilometers or something like this in order to transmit the wind energy from the north to the south. So it's again,
Yeah, no.
and
Mhm. As I said to when we had kind of the redefining energy review of predictions and then predictions for this year, one of the things I said is that Europe really needs a GuideCo. What does GuideCo stand for? Grid Expansion and Interconnection Development and Cooperative Organization. So it's a UN organization, but it was founded under the auspices of China. The guy who runs China's massive grid and is responsible for China's Asian super grid is the executive chairman of GuideCo, and they are in 141 countries promoting and working on grid interconnections with mostly with high voltage direct current, sometimes with high voltage alternating current. Well, what you have in Europe is kind of a club of senior officials from different utilities, but they're all fussing around instead of executing rapidly. There needs to be a bit more top down in Europe, as is required in North America. These are, the way I'll describe them is what NIMBYism is getting in the way of decarbonization. And at some point, NIMBYism falls over. There are ways around it, especially because we can now bury HVDC, much more easily than can bury alternating current. The concerns in Europe are not technical. They are not the ability to transmit or construct the stuff. They are local regulations and local people preventing movement forward. It's not even a cost thing. The cost just isn't that much.
Yeah, so this is also the last point which you raise in your articles about motivation as well. So where's the motivation? If there is a motivation there to do this transition, and then you actually, as you say, you don't need probably to invest a lot in order to make this transition happen.
Well,
Let us move.
Sure. I was about to lean into one of the other topics for today, which is ignore distractions. What I'll say is that part of what is preventing
my list now, the hydrogen.
Yeah, we'll just bump that to the top, just briefly. And we can return to it if we need to. But one of the things that is occurring, especially out of Germany, is a strong push for moving molecules for energy. They're really tied to it for a variety of historical, political reasons. Some political corruption with ex-chancellor, the ex-chancellor before Merkel, whose name I'm terrible with names. But he's now sits in the.
You mean the friend of the friend of Putin is Gerhard Schröder? Yeah.
Yes, yeah, who
Mhm.
immediately upon leaving office was given a €1 million a year board of directors seat on Gazprom subsidiary Nord Stream, and unrepentantly has been pushing Russian gas down Europe's throat for decades. Um, so the Association of European Pipelines last year funded a big study by DNV, the big, pipeline and fossil fuels um, infrastructure and maritime shipping registrar, but also wind turbine and transmission registrar. And the DNV people basically were the fossils for or the molecules for energy types. And they created this thing which said it was a lot cheaper to make hydrogen offshore wind farms and put it in pipelines and pipe that to Europe rather than to Germany, rather than to transmit it. And it was a bogus study for the wrong people. But that's part of the distraction. There are a lot of vested interests who are really trying to push bad solutions because they
Mm.
favor their business models. And so you have to really dig into the underpinnings to say, how skeptical should I be about this report? And I spend a lot of time doing that as well as looking at the actuals of the reports. Out of Germany right now, for the past 5 or 10 years, Gruppendenken has meant that they are spending far too much time and energy looking at hydrogen in all its glorious forms for energy instead of just getting on with electrifying. And so
Yeah.
that's going to bite them in the butt from a strategic perspective. Anyway, back to you.
Let's move to overbuild renewable generation. That was another action, climate action, which will work, and it's easy. So the antithesis is about the solar and wind are not so cheap if we focus not only on the cost of the solar panels and wind turbines, but consider investments required into the grid for the storage, if any. Storage is, of course, storage is important because we need to avoid this intermittency of the wind and solar. And yeah, and then again, it goes back to the batteries. The batteries are not good because we again need just what we have discussed: mining for the earth reserves, producing batteries. So it's better. Why we're not considering then the full chain? And then if you consider the whole full value chain, then renewable is not so cheap as it's going to be. So, but you are saying, okay, we need to overbuild renewable generation, proposing
Well,
to do that. Yeah.
well, let's start with Simon Michaud again. Who is never responded to any of the critiques by anybody of his completely flawed paper, and is enjoying lots of the usual suspects paying a lot of attention to him. He's a minor researcher about explosion dust, um, and the paper is not peer reviewed. And so, one of the many, many mistakes, he made the primary energy fallacy mistake, where he assumed we had to replace all of the fossil fuel energy, not all the energy services. That was one of them. But another mistake he made, or mistake is hard to claim in this regard because it's such motivated thinking. He said in his paper that you have to have 4 weeks of batteries storage for every unit of renewable energy. And none of the modeling shows that. That is a completely specious argument. So he's multiplying the amount of electricity required by at least 2 or 3, and then he's multiplying the amount of storage you need by a lot. So let's break this down a bit. So thing one, we don't need to actually build battery storage nearly as much as people think. For example, the UK is building a lot of lithium-ion battery storage, but that's short-term, 1 to 4 hour, fast response batteries. And according to Mark Wilson of Intelligent Land Investments, who's building a lot of it, they're actually going to be complete with all the battery storage that the United Kingdom needs in 2028 or 2029. There's a short-term period of building batteries, but batteries don't do long-term storage. And that's why Mark is also developing pumped hydro and is specifically developing closed loop off river pumped hydro. That model says, let's find something with like 400 meters or more head height, distance between the upper and lower reservoirs, Let's find a place that they're fairly close together, like a hill. Let's find a place where there's maybe a gully in a dry gully up the hill and a place at the bottom. And we build a couple of small reservoirs, like a kilometer on a side, like ponds.
Mhm.
Um, and we make them deep enough. And we maybe store 1 billion liters of water, like a gigaliter. And if you have 500 meters and two 1 kilometer square ponds, you have a gigawatt hour of storage. Um, Now, there's a lot of places in Europe and everywhere where you can find those conditions for a couple of small ponds that aren't on rivers and aren't disrupting fish spawning. They're not preventing downstream silt. They're not creating anaerobic conditions in massive reservoirs, blah, 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 blah. The concerns about hydroelectric dams on rivers. So there's a lot more resource than most people think, even in Europe. And we're building a lot. Like it, I always like to say, if you're trying to figure out what will likely scale as a decarbonization solution, look at what China is successfully doing. And what China is successfully doing is building a lot of pumped hydro storage. It's got 19 gigawatts of capacity new built in the past few years. It's got 365 gigawatts of power um, in construction or in planning over the next decade. And that's probably up to 8 terawatt hours of electricity storage with water, a tunnel, and some turbines. And we've been building and operating pumped hydro since 1907. It is by far the biggest store of energy on the grid, and it's going to continue to be the biggest store of energy on the grid because once again, it's 1 billion liters of water is cheap. Reservoirs are relatively cheap for the amount of energy storage you get. And we don't need batteries. We don't need a gigawatt hour of batteries for that. You just need a 1 billion liters of water. And we have a lot of water. This is like tiny percentages of water compared to the water on the face of the earth. So the energy storage is one thing. The second thing is, remember, we broaden the grid. So we broaden the grid to bring electricity from where it's being generated to where it's being needed. If we have storage and we have transmission, we don't need the storage near where the consumption is. We need it on the grid somewhere where it's convenient.
Mhm.
And the third thing is when we say overbuild, well, the only form of electrical generation that's run at maximum operation right now is nuclear. And that's the reason for that is because if we run it at less than 90%, it's uneconomic. So it has to run 90% of the time. Um, when we say overbuild, let's take gas plants. A lot of gas plants are running at 5 or 10% of the time, selling electricity only at highest electricity prices. And they're avoiding costs and maximizing revenue. Gas plants in North America are right now running under 50% capacity factor on average because they're supplying peaking demand. Coal plants in the United States are at 40%. Coal plants in China are at 49%, I think, this year, capacity factor. We aren't running the generation assets we have at full capacity today. So why do we assume that wind and solar are going to be running at full capacity all the time? It doesn't make sense. So when I say overbuild, I'm talking about continuing the pattern we've already done. And the second thing is when we say overbuild, we're talking, the modeling shows that with grid connections and storage, transmission and storage, it's 25% overbuild, not 3 times overbuild, which many people think. The last thing I'll say about intermittency is something that is less obvious than most people think. People don't,
Mhm.
this, I found this recently that people miss this one. So when we say wind and solar are intermittent, we tend to think of that as the capacity factor, maybe 40% for wind energy and maybe 20% for solar. But wind farms actually generate electricity. They're actually turning 85% or more of the time. They're just not producing maximum possible energy. So, and they ramp up and ramp down very slowly. They're very easy to manage on grids, very predictable. The point there is that wind turbines are actually delivering electricity 85% of the time. And if you have overbuild them by 25%, frequently you've got enough electricity, even if it's not at optimal. So similarly with solar, solar runs a lot more of the day than you think. This is a point I made when I was speaking to the Indian Smart Utility Week. I was invited to present at a special plenary session of their annual utility conference across 28 state utilities um, uh, in New Delhi. Solar panels at the time I was talking to them were generating electricity 12 hours of the day. They're just not generating very much at dawn or dusk. They're generating the most at solar noon, but it's still generating electricity in the morning and late afternoon. And so we have a lot more electrical generation from wind and solar than you think when you account for the curve of generation across the wind and sun profiles. And so overbuilding is only a 25% gain. And wind and
Mm.
solar are cheap. Even if you add 25% of the costs, they're not that expensive. So the statements about the amount of storage that are required are usually wrong. The amount of energy that's required is wrong. The requirement that it be batteries is wrong. So these are the antitheses are disinformation. And once again, why are people excited by this disinformation and promoting it? Well, then you get back into, understand the motivations of the people making the claims and amplifying them.
Mm. The other one was about shutdown of coal and gas generation aggressively, which we have touched upon as well. And the argument's going also the same way, but I think you have covered this and say, okay, the coal plants are more efficient because now the newest ones are going up to 50% of the efficiency, and solar and wind is lower. Is actually low efficient, and then we might be facing blackouts. I'm sorry, if we don't have the backup capacity of gas and coal.
Oh, sure. So let's take this apart one by one. So when I say shut down coal and gas aggressively, I also mean strategically. We can look at supercritical coal, and it's generating perhaps 800 grams of carbon dioxide or equivalent per kilowatt hour of electricity. It's not great. But it's a lot better than legacy coal plants running brown coal and generating maybe 1.4 kilograms of CO2 or equivalent per kilowatt hour. And those older coal plants frequently had higher sulfur emissions, higher particulate emissions, higher mercury emissions. They're burning dirtier coal, they're burning unclean coal. So you look across, similarly, there's gas plants. Gas plants have nitrous oxides, which are precursors to smog, but they're another variant of nitrous oxide is a high global warming potential gas. But the precursors to smog creates childhood asthma. So when we say, and some of those gas plants leak a lot of methane. So when we say shut down coal and gas aggressively, look across the fleets of coal and gas plants, identify the highest emitters with the highest health impacts, target those for more rapid strategic shutdown than the rest, and maintain the smallest number of lowest emission, lowest health impact coal and gas plants necessary for declining capacity factors over time. I mentioned that gas and coal in the United States and China are running under 50% capacity factors right now because that's all they're doing. They're there when the wind and sun aren't sufficient for peak. So as more and more wind comes online, more and more storage comes online, more and more transmission comes online, the capacity factors on those gas and coal plants is going to drop and drop and drop and drop. So we're going to need, as I said to India a couple of weeks ago, you need to actually create a mechanism for them to survive until they're no longer needed. But shutting down the worst ones aggressively, one of the untold stories out of China, everybody's talking about how much new coal they're building. Well, except that they've got 1.1 terawatt hours of coal approved or in operation, but they've shut down, mothballed, or canceled 775 gigawatts of coal as well. They are replacing a lot of their worst old coal plants with new supercritical plants. So their total coal capacity isn't increasing nearly as much as people assume, and they're running it at lower and lower capacity factors every year. So when you look at the actual behavior in that in different countries, you see this pattern working out. So some of the highest ones, Denmark actually nationalized its coal plants so that it could provide them means to continue to exist to back up their grid as they decarbonized. And we're going to see more and more of that. But job one, get rid of the worst ones. If you don't need coal or gas, don't burn it. And if it's really unhealthy, like I did a math recently, or 3 or 4 years ago, every coal plant in the United States kills about 80 people a year just
Mm.
from pollution.
Mm.
So, right, so there's really easy ways to deal with this. And the highest pollution ones with the highest health impacts are the highest carbon dioxide emission ones as well.